Pastor is doing a series called Writing a Better Story. And so what I thought I'd do on this Sunday before Dr. King's day, I thought I'd find a story that also met with his story and then share them both with you. And I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea if I'm going to do that, that I bring a storybook. So I created my own little storybook. There we go. Got to get the picture in there. See? Now I know it's all shiny and that. But I went online and there's these wonderful paintings of this Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so I could convince myself I'm writing a story, I created my own storybook. There it is. And I'm going to read the story. It's in Daniel 3 if you're interested. You can find, I'm not going to tell you how the story ends. You'll see why. But, oh, I forgot. These days when I tell a story, I need these. All right. So, I also forgot this. In my class, when I tell a story, I always ask my class to begin the story, because we know that every good story starts with 3 words. You're very good. Much better in the first service. So let's do that again. Ready? 1, 2, 3. A powerful king named Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He sent word to all the political and societal leaders, "Come to the dedication of my statue." And they came, and they gathered before the statue, and they listened as it was read. "People of all races, nations, and languages, when you hear the sound of the horn and other musical instruments, it is commanded that you shall bow down and worship the golden statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace." So, whenever the people heard the music, they bowed down and worshiped Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. Now, in this story, I'm going to pause and offer narration at given points. And in this first part of the story, I see idol worship. It's actually a very good description of it. The idol here was a 90-foot statue, gold and shiny. Worship of this giant, shiny object was always preceded by ceremony. In this case, it was music. And the music acted as the cue for the physical act, bowing down, that would show everybody's submission and obedience. But there was always someone not bowing. But they weren't being disobedient. They were generally soldiers or other officials who were watching to make sure everyone else was being obedient. Because whenever and wherever there is idol worship, there is always someone watching. And the story continues. So at the sound of the music, all the people bowed and worshipped. One day, a group of Chaldeans went to the king and informed on the Jews, "Long live you, your king. Your decree stands that those who refuse to obey must be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace." "There are certain Jews," they said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are the ones you put in charge in Babylon. But they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden statue you have asked them to worship." Those individuals who are watching, the ones who are watching everybody else's obedience, they're always so ready, so willing to accuse, even when they know the penalty for disobedience is death, blazing furnace. And you have to ask why. Why would they be so ready if the penalty is so harsh? And my thought is because accusation is the greatest evidence of your obedience. You see, in a system of idol worship, accusation equals obedience. And whenever and wherever there is idol worship, there is always accusation. In this part of the story, quote, "A group of Chaldeans proved their obedience by going to the king and informing on the Jews." Does that line send chills through anyone else as it does me? And the story continues. King Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and demanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. "Is it true," he demanded, "that you have refused to serve my gods and worship the gold statue that I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship my statue I have made when you hear the music. But if you refuse, you shall be thrown into the blazing furnace. What God will rescue you then from my power?" I will give you one more chance. Why? The decree was clear. It says, anyone who refused to obey will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace immediately. No mention of a second chance. So why? And I think the answer is in the crowd. You see, Nebuchadnezzar offered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego a second chance before a crowd that had gathered. You see, the second chance was a public test of obedience, reinforced by a fearful consequence. Bow and worship, or die. Directly, the test is of the three young men. Only they refused to bow. Only they faced the consequence. But indirectly, and very importantly, the test is also for the crowd. Because the entire crowd felt the fear. Because they knew that they too would face such a test and consequence if they chose not to bow. Wherever and whenever there is idol worship, there are always tests and fear. And the story continues. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from your blazing furnace. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty." I like to imagine a pause in the story here, a little moment of silence as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stare right at the king. And they're speaking with their eyes, all the words left unstated, all the questions left unasked, as if they were saying, "We have faith in our God. Do you have faith in your gods, Nebuchadnezzar? Do you have faith in your idol? Do you have faith in the ceremony and the ritual behind it? And since you are really the one behind it, do you have faith in you, Nebuchadnezzar? Well then, throw us in. Our God will deliver us. Our God will rescue us. Have you thought what you will do then before all these people when that happens?" I love this part of the story because these three young men had reversed the public test. It was now Nebuchadnezzar being tested. I almost imagine that the crowd had shifted their focus from the three young men to see what they would do over to the king. What are you going to do, king? Whenever and wherever there is idol worship, courage always makes the story so much more interesting. And the story continues. But if not, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, we will never serve your gods. We will never worship the gold statue you have set up. When the three young men say, "But if not," can't you see the crowd leaning in, maybe gasping? Because they know, but if not? But if not means they die. But if not means they go in the blazing furnace. Where do they get that kind of courage? Why are they not afraid like we're afraid? It would be reasonable to ask such questions. But those questions wouldn't be enough to understand. Because you see, whenever and wherever there is idol worship and accusation and public spectacles and fears and courage, there is always something more inside those who resist. There is a desperate desire to live. Consider the circumstances of the three young men. They had been put on that public stage and given exactly two choices: bow or furnace. Now, if they bow, they are spared the furnace. But if they bow, they would lose their life. You see, because they understood that with every breath they take after, they would die a little more. It would be like if all the breaths they take together thereafter would constitute a fire that would burn their conscience and consume their faith day after day. No. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that kind of death would be far too painful. So, they chose the furnace. Because they wanted to live. Now, I know some of you, like me for a long time in my faith, Old Testament stories don't quite do it for you because they're old, bluntly. This one was 580 BC. So maybe you want a newer story. But before we get to it, I just want you to really clarify how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ensured life. And to do that, you have to consider yourself in a 580 BC crowd in Babylon. And you have to imagine you have been doing the same ritual day after day after day. No matter what you're doing, you hear that music. Oh, I gotta go bow. Some of you may bow willingly, you may believe in the ceremony, but some of you bow fearfully, maybe even angrily, because you know you're bowing before a big shiny object, 90 foot high, and it's really only upon a thread of an insecure king with an ego, 900 foot high. That's why you're bowing. It makes you angry. And then one day, you see three men. And they're refusing to do the ceremony you hate. And they're defying the king. And then you hear them proclaim a trust in a God that will save them. And then they say, but if not, still not going to do your silly ceremony. If you were in that crowd, wouldn't you pull your eyes up? Wouldn't you look? Wouldn't you lean in and wouldn't you listen? Wouldn't your adrenaline start to pump? Wouldn't your heart beat a little bit faster? Wouldn't you be alive? Wouldn't you be spared for just a moment from that soul-killing ritual of false idol worship? So if you're in that audience, I think you can understand there's three ways that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ensured life that day. One, if God delivered them from the blazing furnace, they live on this earth obedient to their conscience, to their faith in their God. Two, if God allowed the flames to consume their flesh, they live closer to the God they love and trusted and obey. But three, whether they're delivered or not, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego ensured life would go on in you, the crowd. Because they woke your conscience. You see, it's almost like a seed. Their conscience and their act of faith reached out to you, the crowd. And like seeds, it planted questions in any one of you that is not yet spiritually dead from the ritual. The questions are like, who are these guys? Where did they get that kind of courage? Who is this God they're talking about? Why do they love him even if he won't save them? And this king, what kind of king would do this? And those questions, once asked, will seek conscience. And then a conscience, once activated, will pursue a faith in something more than a silly ritual. That's how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ensured life on this earth regardless of the outcome of the furnace. Conscience, reaching out and awakening conscience. Faith, reaching out and inspiring faith. Life, being born out of defiance to ritualistic idol worship. But again, that was 580 BC. Maybe it's just a good Old Testament story that we can appreciate. So let me see if I can offer a more recent story. Let's go back about 52 years. November 5th, 1967. Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is telling his story, or telling his congregation the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when he finished, he said the following to his congregation. These young men practice civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a commitment to conscience. And there comes a time when moral men and women cannot obey a law which conscience tells them is unjust. They chose instead to be obedient to a higher law. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saying, I must be obedient to a king so I can be obedient to the king. Dr. King virtually screamed that last line. While the members of the congregation responded enthusiastic with encouragements and affirmations. That's right, Dr. King. Go ahead. Teach. Make it plain. There was great emotion in Dr. King, and there was great emotion in that congregation that day. And there is extraordinary reason when you consider the context of that sermon for that emotion. And to understand that context, I'm going to take you backwards 12 years. December 1st, 1955. An African-American seamstress who worked in a Montgomery department store was coming home from work early evening. She was tired. She gets on the bus and she takes a seat in the middle of the bus. A white man comes on the bus and he demands her seat. He cued the music for the expected physical act that she was to get up and move. But as I said, Rosa Parks was tired. And she was tired of the spiritual death of segregation. She wanted to live. So she followed her conscience, defied the man, and remained in her seat. And I always like to imagine that Rosa Parks was sitting there, looking out the window, while all these white people decide, what are we going to do with her? And as she looked out the window of the bus, she saw some version of a blazing furnace all around the bus. What's going to happen? But if not, I'm sitting anyways. Rosa Parks' conscience and her courage sparked a year-long bus boycott. It was successful, by the way. But it was successful in large part because it was led by a 26-year-old pastor who had been in town less than a year. To encourage the good people of Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his very first civil rights speech. And I'd like to offer you a sample.
My friends, I want it to be known that we are going to work with real and bold determination to gain justice on the churches in this city. And we are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dream of a never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. God has no meaning.
Earlier I asked you to imagine yourself in an audience in 580 BC Babylon. Now I want you to imagine yourself at the Holt Street Baptist Church that night in Montgomery, Alabama. But if you're going to do that, you have to imagine yourself, if you're not already, as black. And you have to include in that imagination that goal, day of your life, you understood full well that at any time in your day, a white person could cue the music and expect you to do a physical act of submission and obedience. And you would be tired. But on that night, you would be fully alive. Because on that night, the conscience and the courageous act of Rosa Parks and the words of Dr. King were exploding seeds into your conscience. And you too would be responding. That's right. We are a Christian people. We do follow the teachings of Jesus. Go ahead, teach, because we are not wrong. God Almighty is right, and Jesus was way more than a dreamer. Make it plain, because love has meaning. And justice and righteousness will run down like a mighty stream. Conscience, reaching out and awakening conscience. Faith, reaching out and inspiring faith. Life, being born out of defiance to false idols. But I also want you to imagine yourself walking home, and you, being black in 1980 Alabama, you might be thinking about 3 words that Dr. King never said that night. But if not. But if not means justice and righteousness will not run down like a mighty stream. But if not means lost jobs and lost income and poverty. But if not means burning crosses and rocks through windows and bombs under porches and church basements. But if not means bodies beat and stabbed and shot and lynched. But if not would have been a very big reality for you, for those cheering people. In fact, for those cheering people, but if not was a way of life, because they now were African American people who were refusing to bow before the false idol of racial superiority. That speech and that bus boycott introduced our country to Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And then on November 5th in the Ebenezer Baptist Church, after 12 years of its movement and many gains and many hardships and countless death threats, Dr. King told his congregation about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with that context. And his congregation had also shared that context, and that's why they were shouting out, "That's right, Dr. King, go ahead, teach, make it plain." Almost exactly 5 months later, April 3rd, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his last civil rights speech. Here's how he concluded. Do we have that?
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
He virtually collapses into the arms of the friends behind. He was sick that day. Initially, he wasn't going to go to the rally. It was a rally for garbage workers in Memphis who were on strike. Something told him to get out of bed and go. And he didn't really have a speech prepared. It's of different parts. But something got into him at a given point. The moment he said, well, I don't know what's going to happen now. And then it went through. And I want to rephrase just one line. I'm going to say it verbatim, except I'm going to substitute 3 words. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But if not, I just want to do God's will. Dr. King was shot and killed the very next day while he stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968. But if not, had finally caught up with Dr. King. The blazing inferno of racial prejudice and hatred in America had finally consumed his flesh. But he lives on. We celebrate his legacy tomorrow. And so, the story continues. Oh, that's right. You see, the final chapters of that story have yet to be written. Because that's our job. We're not here just to appreciate Dr. King tomorrow, and definitely don't make him an idol. Our job tomorrow is to write the next chapters. We become the authors. Because we're in the crowd today. Well, you ask how? How do I write those chapters? Just an ordinary person. Well, think of these stories we've shared today. Here are the elements. There's idol worship. There's ceremonies and physical acts of submission and obedience. Always people watching, always people ready to accuse. And there's acts of conscience. And the acts of conscience ultimately expose the idols and ensure life. Conscience, reaching out, awakening conscience. Faith, reaching out, inspiring faith. Life being born out of defiance to unjust, ritualistic idol worship. Dr. King said, one day we as a people will get to the promised land. Well, I hate to tell you, we ain't there yet. So it's not enough just to appreciate a good story. We have to write a better story. I wonder what kind of story we will write. You had to imagine yourself in the other 2 crowds I mentioned. Not on the main stage, I asked you to imagine yourself in the crowd. But you don't have to imagine yourself in the crowd today. There is idol worship everywhere. There is injustice everywhere. Every day, unconscionable acts are done. To notice, all you have to do is stop bowing. Now, I say that not from judgment. I say it from experience, because I know from experiences in my life what bowing does to a conscience. Because when you bow too often, too enthusiastically to anything, you stop asking questions. You stop seeking answers. You stop searching for faith in anything other than the ceremony you're bowing in. And the way you know that you've become a victim to idol worship is when you see somebody else not bowing to what you're bowing to, your reflex is to accuse and cast judgment. You don't talk to them. You don't ask questions. You don't seek answers. You accuse and condemn. And I don't know about you, but I do know I don't want to write a chapter where I am some obedient tattletale taken sides with some powerful person who designed some ceremony so they are worshipped. I would rather write chapters where there are acts of conscience, where I bring my eyes up so I can see courage, where I lean in and listen so I can hear conscience. And when I open my mouth, it's not to accuse, but it's to ask questions. It's not to condemn. It's to seek answers and strengthen faith. Because my thought from these stories that we've listened to today, if I do that consistently, I will strengthen my conscience. I will deepen my faith, and I may even develop a desperate desire to live, regardless what stage I'm drawn to. Because you don't know. You're in the crowd now, but you don't know when you'll be called to the main stage. Remember, Rosa Parks was a seamstress in a Montgomery, Alabama department store. She was called to the stage, but apparently she had been working on her conscience. She had been deepening her faith. She was ready for that stage. And it wasn't her choice. She was called to it. So, I have many more chapters to write before I get to that place. I am no Rosa Parks. I don't think any of us will ever be a Dr. King. You likely have many more chapters to write as well. But I plead with you this morning as we celebrate Dr. King's Day tomorrow, write those chapters. Strengthen your conscience. Deepen your faith while you are in the crowd, because you never know where you'll be called out of the crowd to some version of a public stage, facing some version of a blazing furnace with some severe consequence. Do it now, while maybe the only consequence is another individual's or friends or co-workers' disapproval. It's a blazing furnace, trust me, I understand. That's hard. But do it at that level. And then strengthen it, and strengthen it, and strengthen it. And next thing you know, you're the leader. And you're changing our country's story. And I say this bluntly, we have fewer excuses to write those chapters than almost anybody else that's ever walked this planet. We live in the United States of America. We have a First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, nor abridging your freedom of speech, nor your freedom of assembly. They can't tell us not to meet here and say what we want. And we are followers of Christ. You want the world's greatest civil disobedience? Read the Gospels. My goodness. He never bowed to any man, to any ceremony, to any idol, only to his Father. And then he calls us to do the same. American Christians have a wonderful opportunity to write new chapters of conscience. So on this eve of Martin Luther King's Day, please keep that in mind and ask yourself, what chapter am I going to write today, this week, this month, this year? And will I be ready if I'm called to that main stage, facing that blazing furnace? Let me start here so I can one day be ready if he calls me there. If you would, bow your heads. I'd like to pray. God, my God, thank you. Thank you for calling us all here today. Thank you for the stories that you offer us, the Old Testament and the New, for your story. Thank you for Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and thousands of others that wrote a new chapter in our nation's history and made us all better, made it possible for us to congregate as the people we are today, of all different races and ethnicities and backgrounds. Please let us not forget that story and our responsibility to continue that story in the next chapters. Let us do far more than just appreciate a good story tomorrow. Let us resolve to write new chapters that turns our nation's story into a better direction. We love you, God, and we thank you for this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And as Vincent always says, go out and be people of grace and peace. Thank you. Love you.